All right. So just before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors for tonight's class. Sponsored this evening by the Levy Shachat families in memory of Nate Levy, Zalman Nasan Ben David Ruvain, whose yortzeit whose yortzeit was last week. Through our learning, the neshama should have an aliyah. And just before we begin, I want to say a big mazel tov to the Gibsons, Mark and Felicia. Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How's Junior?
Oh,
Everyone's doing well. Everyone's doing well.
Good. Baruch Hashem. All right, mazel tov. All right, let's begin. Let's begin. All right, so this week, God willing, we are going to be reading the Parsha of the Parah Duma, Parshas Parah, which is in a list of 4 Parshos during the year that we read that are significant to this time of year, starting with Parsha Shkalim, which we read right before Purim, 2 weeks before Purim, that signified the communal fund that was collected right at the end of the fiscal year for the upcoming fiscal year of the temple that started Rosh Chodesh Nisan, so that there was enough in the communal fund. Then we read Parshas Zachor right before Purim, signifying the destruction of Amalek, which we spoke about last time, about how Amalek is still around today, and therefore it becomes all the more necessary for us to continue to review and read the Parsha of Zachor. This week, we're going to read Parshas Parah, which we'll discuss in just a moment, and then we are going to read Parshas Chodesh right before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, right before Pesach. So Parshas Parah that we're going to be reading this week, as we said, is brought down in Shulchan Aruch that we have an obligation to read. And in fact, the Shulchan Aruch says that of all of these 4 significant Parshos, 2 stand out as most critical, which we'll get to in a second. And by the way, these 2 Parshos we read of Zachor and Parah, that these 2 very significant Parshos are perhaps the only 2 Parshos that we read throughout the year that are deoraisa, that are commanded from the Torah to read these Parshos. Now, we know for sure Zachor is. We spoke about that last time. The Torah tells us that we have an obligation of Zachor, of remembering what Amalek did to us. And we know that the way to do that is through reading from the Torah on a communal level. And that's what we discussed last time. So it's pretty clear and obvious that Parsha Zachor, the Gemara Megillah makes this very clear, that the Parsha of Zachor, reading the Parsha of Amalek and what Amalek did to us, remembering that is a biblical obligation. There's no way around that. Parshas Parah, we're going to see the Shulchan Aruch is going to tell us, is also deoraisa, also potentially is biblical. There is one other laning or a few other lanings during the year that may have biblical origin. The Ramban suggests that maybe the laning that we do over Yomim Tovim, over the holidays, are deoraisa, because the Torah refers to them as Mikra'e Kodesh. So because of that, the Ramban says that the lanings over Yontif may be deoraisa, but there's definitely consensus that Zachor is deoraisa, but Parah, which we're going to be reading this week, it seems to be coming out of left field that it's deoraisa. This is what the Shulchan Aruch says. Yeshomrim, there are those that say, Sheparshas Zachor uParshas Parah Aduma, that the Parsha of Parah Aduma, which what's it about? It's about the burning of the red heifer that is done in order to, when you mix the ashes of the red heifer with water from the Mei Shiluach, so that is used in order to purify someone who was contaminated through the impurity of a corpse. So says the Shulchan Aruch that Uparshas Paraduba Chayavim Likrosa Midoraisa. We have an obligation to read these parshos on a level deoraisa. Lefikach, therefore, B'nei Hayoshvim She'em Lahem minyan, that if someone is sitting in a place that doesn't have a minyan, they should take every effort necessary. They should come to somewhere that has a minyan, the Shabbos Halalu during Zachor and Paraduma, Kedei Lishmoa Parshas Elu Shem Doraisa, in order to hear Parshas Parah and Parshas Zachor, which are Deoraisa, which are from the Torah. So we mentioned before that Zachor, it's pretty obvious that it's D'Oraisa. It's pretty obvious that this is Torah mandated. Where is Parshas Parah in it being Torah mandated? I mean, even let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah tells us, quoting from a pretty significant consensus amongst the commentators in the Shulchan Aruch, which, by the way, is the Mishnah Berurah's job. The Mishnah Berurah, the whole modus operandi of the Shulchan Aruch, of the Mishnah Berurah, is to give us a consensus of the later commentaries after the Shulchan Aruch's publication. Again, the Shulchan Aruch was published in the 1530s, I think 1532. I think the Shulchan Aruch was published. So, talking about in the 16th century, the Shulchan Aruch was published. The Mishnah Berurah was published in the very early part of the 20th century, right? So we're talking about pretty significant time lapse. During that time, there were a number of different opinions and commentaries and expansions on the Shulchan Aruch. So what the Mishnah Berurah tries to do is he tries to create consensus of all of those later authorities and opinions. So this is what he brings over here. He says, Hashlishisi Parshas Parah. What's the whole purpose of reading Parshas Parah? He says, because Shechein Haya Sreifasa Bamidbar, because in the desert, when they were getting close to Nisan, they burnt a new Parah Aduma. They burnt a new red heifer, Samach Nisan, close to Nisan, Kidei Lahazos Ba Es Yisrael Ba'afar Achatas, in order so that Bnei Yisrael would be able to become purified, in order so that they could bring their korbanos to the Beis Hamikdash, in order so that they can bring their korban Pesach, their Paschal lamb, to the Beis Hamikdash with complete purity. So this is the whole reason for the burning of for the reading of Parshas Parah, in order to review the laws pertaining to the giving of the karbanos, of the karban Pesach. So I understand that it was very practical at the time of, when we were able to bring the Parah Aduma, but okay, that was something that they needed. This is the reason for the giving. This is the reason for the reading of Parshas Parah, that they needed to review these laws in order so that they could properly prepare for the giving of the Karban Pesach, the Paschal lamb. But that does not necessarily mean that there needs to be this communal reading today. Why is it still D'Oraisa? Why is it still so necessary to read? So what we have to figure out is, why is this still even practical today? That's what we have to figure out. So comes along the Stipler Rav Yisrael Yaakov Kamenetsky. The Stipler passed away in 1985, was the leader of the Bnei Brak community, following the footsteps of his brother-in-law, the Chazon Ish. His brother-in-law, the Chazon Ish, was actually the Shadchan between him and his sister, where Rav Avram Yishaya Karelitz, who was the Chazon Ish, picked up the Sefer Kehilas Yaakov, picked up the Sefer that was written by the Stipler. This is the way the story goes. He read the Sefer, he read the writings of the Stipler, and said, "Oh my gosh, this fellow is unbelievable. I'd love to get him set up with my sister." So he sends a note, and he gets the two of them connected on a date. And the Stipler lived in a town far away. I don't know all the details exactly. I assume the Stipler lived in Stiple. That's why he's called the Stipler Gaon. And the Chazon Ish, I believe, lived in Vilna. So, okay, there was some sort of a trip that needed to be made. The Stipler, when he starts his journey to go out on the date, so he gets on the train and he sees the seats on the train they look very familiar to the at least the material, the fabric that the seats were made out of. He was concerned that they had shatnez, that there was a prohibited mixture of fibers of wool and linen that was in the fibers of the fabric of the train. And this is like a 10-hour train ride. So, but at the same time, you can't sleep on the fabrics of shatnez. you can't get any enjoyment from them. So he stood on the train the entire time, the entire trip before his date. You imagine a first date, you don't sleep all night. Now, a lot of people before a first date don't sleep because they're just nervous. He had his nerves, and he also lacked sleep because he physically couldn't sleep because he was standing the entire time on the train. So he gets to his date, and the date starts. The first few minutes, a lovely oh, hello, nice to meet you, lovely conversation. About a half hour into the date, he falls asleep at the table. He falls asleep at the table. So she goes back to her brother and says, listen, I don't know what his story was. The first half hour seemed very nice, but then I guess I got so boring for him, he fell asleep. I don't think this is such a good idea for me to pursue going out with him again. I'm sure he's a great Torah scholar, but I don't know if this is the guy for me. And the Chazon Ish said, no, it doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. There must be the reason. So he found out that the reason was because of the train thing. And because of that, his wife, the Chazon Ish's sister, was totally blown away that if you have such a person with midos, the fact that he actually went for the whole trip and he took as much energy as he could to have a lovely conversation with me, to get to know me, and his exhaustion just overtook him, all because he was trying to observe mitzvos properly. That's the kind of guy I want to marry. And they ended up getting married, and they built a whole dynasty of Torah learning in the Bnei Brak community. The Steipler's son is Rav Chaim Kanevsky, one of the Gedolei Hador. So the Steipler addresses this question of why is it that we still have an obligation to read Parsha Zachar, and why is it that it's D'oraisa? I should point out, by the way, that not everyone agrees with this opinion of the Shulchan Aruch. That the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, he suggests that the obligation to learn, the obligation to review Parshas Parah every single year is a Torah obligation. Now, the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, disagreed with this. He thought that was a big mistake. In fact, he thought that the original source that the Shulchan Aruch got this from, which was a Tosfos in Brachos and Daf Yud Gimel, that he thought that the version of that specific text that the Shulchan Aruch had was an incorrect version of the text. That it was just it was a mistake that the Shulchan Aruch was making. But that's not generally the way that the Shulchan Aruch is approached in this particular topic. And nevertheless, the Shulchan Aruch does say that there's an obligation on a biblical level to read Parshas Parah. So Steipler asked, where is the source of this public obligation to read Parshas Parah, the Parsha about the red heifer, the Parah Aduma? So he points to a pasuk at the end of Parshas Mitzorah. Now, Parshas Tazria Mitzorah, in large part, has to do with basically two topics. Number one are topics of impurity. That really has to do with topics of impurity. Number one, having to do with topics of impurity, that if a person contracts any sort of impurity on their skin, ailments like tsaras and the like, leprosy. And the other major topic is discussed is someone contracting tumah, contracting impurity. Now, just want to clarify, being impure is not it's not an evil thing. When we say impure here, we don't mean impure the way that it's colloquially used, that you are involved in something that is not good or not right. When we say impurity here, we mean that on a spiritual level, on a spiritual plane, that there are different states that a person could be in. They could either be spiritually pure or spiritually tainted or impure. And basically what that means is that person would have to go through a certain purification process in order to engage in certain activities. It doesn't throw off a person's life completely. They can still have a normal Shabbos, even if a person is impure. It's not going to affect their Shabbos, but it's going to affect the way that they engage with temple service, being able to bring a sacrifice, for example. You can't do that if you're impure. That was the whole institution of Pesach Sheni, the whole institution of the second round of Pesach that happens 1 month after the first Pesach, which happens on Yud Dalid Iyar. The whole institution of that is so that if a person was impure by Nisan. So then by ER, a month later, hopefully they became pure again. And now they have a second chance to bring their Karban Pesach. So there could potentially be a danger, though, in being impure. What's the danger? The danger is that if a person's impure and then they do temple service, so that's a big problem. There could be significant punishment dealt with that. And because we have to make sure we treat the temple with the utmost respect and the utmost reverence, and therefore we need to make sure we do everything we can to understand, to be to have a sense of acknowledgement of where I am holding in my purity and impurity status, in order so that I can go through the proper steps in order to become pure, so I can do the temple service. So this is exactly what the Torah tells us at the end of Parshat Mitzorah. There's an obligation upon Beis Din to his artem, to give warning, to properly educate the Jewish people, mitum asam, regarding their tumah, to make sure that they don't engage in tumah, in order so that v'lo yamutu bitum asam, in order so that they don't, God forbid, receive any sort of capital punishment because they were tameh, bitim et mishkanis. So that way, it just, God forbid, they were impure and then they came into the temple in their impure state. Asher besocham, that's among their in their midst. Basically, there's an obligation upon Beis Din, upon the communal leaders, to make sure that they educate the congregation properly, to educate the people properly, so that everyone is up to speed on what the laws of Tumah and Tara are. Now, this makes a lot of sense if you think about it for temple times. Why? Because it was such a central part of their lives. In fact, the Talmud says that even the average Joe back in the times when the temple stood, were so well versed in the laws of Tumah and Tara, like the way that every single Jew, around the globe that has Jewish identity, probably it has some sort of an idea of, oh yeah, on Pesach we eat matzah, right? That's like pretty standard, Jew. The average Joe, the average Yosef knows that you don't eat chametz on Pesach and you eat matzah on Pesach. So the average Joe back in the times when the temple stood knew these intricate laws of purity and impurity. Why? Because it was such a central part of their lives. It was just part of their daily lives. They knew how the temple worked. They knew how all the sacrifices work. They knew when I can give a sacrifice, when I can't give a sacrifice, because it was just part of the regular routine. But nevertheless, even for people of that generation, of that time, the Torah tells us that there needs to be a communal exercise where we review these laws. So therefore, says the Stipler, this then is the source of the obligation to read Parshas Parah on a yearly basis. Why? Because we have an obligation to review these parshios, as the Torah says, in order for us to be well versed so that we don't make mistakes. So I don't know about you, but I don't see a Beis Hamikdash, right? Okay, so the Stipler told me, right? He figured out, here's the source for where we have to review these laws on a communal level. We need to review the laws of Tumah and Tara on a communal level, but there's no Beis Hamikdash. So once there's a Beis Hamikdash, I understand. So I need to review these laws on a communal level. But without a Beis Hamikdash, why is this necessary? Why is Parshas Parah still D'Oraisa? So this is where our mistake is. That we think, there's no Beis Hamikdash, and therefore I don't need to review these laws. You know what? What if the Beis Hamikdash fell from Shamayim in its completely rebuilt state right now? What if it fell from Shamayim right now? In fact, the Gemara tells us, Amar Rava, B'shash machnis and Adam Ladin, that when a person is brought up for judgment, Omrim Lo. So this is a relatively well-known piece of Gemara. The 6 questions you can ask when you go to Shamayim. Nasata v'natata be'emuna, did you do business ethically? Kava'ati itam l'Torah, did you set aside time for learning Torah? Asakta b'piri v'rivya, were you involved in bringing up the next generation? Tzipita li Yeshua, did you look forward to the salvation? The fourth question. Okay, so this is on the list of the, you can reinterpret this Gemara on the list of the most important things we need to be focusing on, which is anticipating the salvation, looking forward to Mashiach, tzipita Yeshua. God expects of us to be as enthusiastic as we possibly can, and to be anticipating Mashiach's arrival as much as we possibly can. We should be sitting at the edges of our seats, waiting for that push notification through WhatsApps and Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. Mashiach has arrived. It's happening. Everybody, let's go to Israel. It's happening right now. Tzipita Yeshua. Did you anticipate the salvation? In fact, the Brisker Rav said, if you take a look at the Rambam, you know, the 13 principles of faith that that are printed very often at the end of Shacharis in the Siddur, that at the end of the Shacharis service is printed the 13 principles of faith, which it's good. In fact, the Sephardic custom is that even the Chazan at the end of davening, the way he finishes off davening is he actually reads the 13 principles out loud for everyone. It's a good thing, even privately, for a person to review them. I think that's why they're there. To review the Rambam's 13 principles of faith. The 12th principle of faith, which we know is as the famous song, Ani Mamin B'Emuna Shelema B'Vias HaMashiach. I believe with full faith that Mashiach is going to come. This is the 12th of the 13th principles of the Rambam, of the Ani Mamins. But if you take a look at the original writings of the Rambam, where he codifies these 13 principles, take a look at the way he writes it, says the Brisker Rav, that specifically in the principle of the anticipation of Mashiach's arrival, that I believe wholeheartedly the Mashiach is going to come, said the Brisker Rav, that if you look at the words of the Rambam, it's not that I believe wholeheartedly the Mashiach is going to come, but that I believe Mashiach is arriving. You notice the difference. It's not that Mashiach will be coming later, but it's that Mashiach is currently arriving. Says the Rambam, Yemos HaMashiach, V'hu lahamin, lamish yavo, that we believe that Mashiach is shiyavo, is arriving. V'lo yachshov sheyis acher. We don't believe that he's going to be delayed at all, meaning that he's arriving right now. If that's the case, we need to be prepared for Mashiach's arrival. In fact, this was a whole campaign that that the Chavetz Chaim had. The Chavetz Chaim was the religious communal leader of the 19th century and early 20th century. He was really the centurion. I'm scrolling up over here so you can see the introductory page of this work, the Likutei Halachos. The Chavetz Chaim, Yisrael Meir HaKohen, Kagan, was the centurion of I think certainly the 20th century, was the editor-in-chief of the Mishnah Berurah, was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Radin Yeshiva, created a revolution in the area of making sure that we look after the way that we speak, of Lashon Hara. The Chavetz Chaim embodied every aspect of Torah, of being both a tzaddik, a chassid, a gaon, a genius. Like he covered it all. He covered it all. The Chavetz Chaim, at the turn of the 20th century, I think that this particular work was actually published in the year 1900. So right at the turn of the 20th century, he published a work called Likutei Halachos, collection of laws. So at the me show you an example. So in every volume of Talmud, so you have the Talmud, which contains the Mishnayos, all the discussions in the Gemara, and you have the commentaries. You have Rashi and Tosos, and then in the back of every Gemara, at least in the Vilna edition, you have a compendium of the Rif, where the Rif, Rabbeinu Alfasi, he took it kind of looks like a Talmud, like a page of Talmud. He took the Talmud and condensed it into the bottom line halacha. What's the bottom line? There was a whole lot of discussion here that happened in the Talmud, but I want to know what to do. So the Rif on all practical law, anything that was practical, if whatever was practical during the times of the Rif, which was the very beginning of the 11th century, are still very practical today. So he took anything that was practical during his time, condensed all of the teachings of the Talmud into those practical statements, and put his work at the back of the Gemara. The Chavetz Chaim wanted to complete the work of the Rif, where the Rif, as we mentioned before, only addressed that which was practical for his time. Anything that was not practical for the 11th century, the Rif left out. So what would that include? Anything pertaining to the temple, because the temple was not in existence. But the Chavetz Chaim said, well, hold on one second. If we need to be prepared for Mashiach's arrival as if it's happening right now, so then we need to know what to do. When the Beis HaMikdash comes, I'm going to need to know what to do. You're going to have to know what to do. And therefore, in addition to learning the practicality, the bottom line of all the things that we did yesterday, I need to know all the practicality of the things I'm going to be doing tomorrow when I go to the temple, because it's going to be coming tomorrow. And therefore, what the Chavetz Chaim did is that he took all of these teachings from the Talmud, condensed it exactly the same way as a Rif, condensed it into the bottom line halacha for each of the volumes of Talmud that have to deal with temple service and have to do with purity, impurity, all of these things. This is called Likutei Halachos. And he writes over here, he says, Vevakesh l'kol kore. I ask anyone who's going to be reading this pamphlet that I'm laying out, shekodem shiayin beguf hasefer, that before they start reading the actual work that I wrote, yikra mekodem ha'akdama, first read the introduction to the work. Okay? The Chavetz Chaim knew that most of the time people just skip the introduction so that they could start reading the work. But he said, no, this work is different. The introduction is there for a very significant reason. Take a look at the introduction. I'll just read for you one selection from the introduction over here. He says that az nuchal lidrosh betach ma'Hashem Yisbarach, that we can be absolutely certain that Hashem is going to shiavo lanu Mashiach tzidkenu v'yivne lanu beis habechira, that Hashem is going to send us Mashiach and is going to rebuild the third temple, the everlasting temple, very, very soon. Mashiach is coming. Ki anu mitzidenu muchanim. And now we will be able to say, once we review all of these works, once we review all of the laws, and once we are ready from a practical standpoint, because we are going to know what to do, now we can say, muchanim, l'kol eini avoda. We are ready to do all of the work in the temple. Hashem Yisbarach Yisrael amo muchanim atzman ledas dine havoda. Now, this is what the Chavetz Chaim says. Now that Hashem sees that we are ready for Mashiach's arrival because we are well versed in the laws pertaining to the temple service and for when Mashiach comes, so then he writes, he says, certainly, then certainly Hashem is going to expedite Mashiach's arrival. basically the Chafetz Chaim is telling us. He's saying that this is no less practical than any of the other laws that we have to learn. What I do when I wake up in the morning, what I do on Shabbos, what I'm going to be doing at the Pesach Seder this year is not any more practical than what's going to happen when Mashiach comes. Why? Because Mashiach is coming tomorrow. So I'm going to have to know how to bring my Karban Pesach. So what's the very first step in being able to engage with the temple? The very first step is everybody needs to become pure. So what needs to happen in order for everyone to become pure? That's Parah Aduma. Parah Aduma is the very first step that needs to take place. We need to go through the purification process in order for us to even begin any of the temple service. That is the very first step. That the Parah Aduma, just what exactly happens? You have the red heifer, you burn it into ashes, you then take those ashes, you mix it with special water that was drawn from the Mei Shiluach, which is a certain natural body of water that runs through Yerushalayim, that you take water from there, and it all has to be done in a way that keeps the purity of the water and the ashes until the final mixture happens. And then anyone that had ever come in contact with the impurity of a corpse gets sprinkled on by the Kohen, and then that's how they become purified in order to do temple service again. All of the laws pertaining to Parah Aduma is the very first step. And that's why this Shabbos, we are going to be filling the mandate that the Torah tells us to do. That once a year on a communal level, we have to review the laws pertaining to becoming pure in order so that we could properly engage with the temple, which is why this Shabbos, Yishomrim Parshas Zachor, Parshas Parah Aduma, says the Shulchan Aruch, Chayavim L'kros Midoraisa. We have to read these very, very practical parshios, Parshas Zachor that we spoke about last time, that Amalek is extremely practical today. Amalek is alive and well, and they should be eradicated from our midst. And Parah Aduma, we need to be prepared for Mashiach's arrival. The beauty of Parah Aduma, of reading Parah Aduma, is that it does more than just lip service to God, where every single time I daven a Shmona Esrei, 3 times a day, I daven at Samach David Avdecha Meir, that Hashem, please bring Mashiach, please return the throne of David to its rightful place, please Hashem. But now, when we on a communal level read Parshas Parah, what we're essentially saying is, Hashem, we mean it. And you see, we're engaging with the laws. We want to be as ready as we possibly can for Mashiach's arrival. So hopefully this year will be the first of many, many years to come where we read Parshas Parah with purpose, because we are actually ready for Mashiach's arrival. And next year, God willing, when we read Parshas Parah, it's because there's a Beis Hamikdash standing already that we are reviewing the laws of Parah Aduma in order so we could be ready to bring our Karban Pesach appropriately. Okay, we will stop here for now.